Hey guys, welcome back to The Readers. I hope you are having an amazing day. Let's get right into the stories. The first one is an entitled people story. I never thought I'd be writing one of these posts, but after what happened last weekend, I figured this community would appreciate the story. Fair warning, this is going to be long because there's a lot of background that makes the ending so satisfying. So let me start from the beginning. About 3 years ago, my wife and I were house hunting in what used to be a pretty rural area before all the development started. We weren't looking for anything fancy, just something with character that we could afford. Most of the new subdivisions in the area were cookie-cutter HOA communities with houses that all looked exactly the same, beige and boring. That's not really our style. Our realtor showed us this one property that was kind of unique. It was this old farmhouse built back in the 1940s, sitting on about an acre of land. The thing is, over the years, a big subdivision had been built all around it, like literally surrounding it on 3 sides, with this house just sitting there in the middle like some kind of holdout. The developer had tried to buy the original owners out multiple times over the decades, but they'd refused to sell. When those original owners finally passed away, their kids decided to sell rather than deal with the property from across the country. That's where we came in. The house needed work, but it had good bones and tons of character. Plus, the price was reasonable because a lot of buyers were put off by being surrounded by an HOA community. But here's the key part that makes this whole story possible. When the subdivision was originally planned back in the 1980s, the developer had to work around this property since the owners wouldn't sell. The city required the developer to include language in all the HOA documents that specifically exempted the original farmhouse property from any current or future HOA rules, regulations, or fees. Basically, a permanent grandfather clause that could never be removed or modified. Our realtor explained this to us during the showing, and honestly, it was a huge selling point. My wife and I both hate HOAs. We'd heard too many horror stories about power-hungry board members measuring grass height and fining people for having the wrong shade of beige on their shutters. The idea that we could live in a nice neighborhood but be completely exempt from all that nonsense was perfect. The day we closed on the house, our realtor gave us what she jokingly called the binder. It was this thick folder containing copies of every single document related to our property's special status. The original deed with the grandfather clause highlighted, the city planning documents, the HOA founding documents with our exemption clearly stated, and even some correspondence from lawyers over the years. She told us to keep it handy because we'd probably need it someday. At the time, I thought she was being overly cautious. The HOA seemed pretty laid back, and we figured we'd just keep to ourselves and avoid any drama. Boy, was I wrong. See, about 6 months after we moved in, the HOA elected a new president. Let me tell you about this woman. I'm gonna call her Sheriff Patty because that's honestly what she acted like. She was probably in her early 60s, always perfectly dressed, and had this way of walking around the neighborhood like she owned every blade of grass. Sheriff Patty took her job very, very seriously. Within her first month as president, she'd already sent violation notices to half the neighborhood for various infractions. Trash cans left out an hour too long after pickup, mailbox numbers that weren't the approved font, flower gardens with non-approved plant varieties. She actually carried around a ruler to measure grass height and would take photos of violations with a camera that had one of those timestamp features. Now, since we weren't part of the HOA, these violations shouldn't have applied to us. But Sheriff Patty didn't see it that way. About 2 months into her reign of terror, I found a notice tucked into our front door. It was a formal violation notice claiming our mailbox was the wrong color and demanding we replace it within 30 days or face fines. I honestly thought it was some kind of mistake at first. I called the HOA management company and they confirmed that yes, the new president had instructed them to send us violation notices despite our exemption status. The person on the phone sounded embarrassed and said they'd tried to explain to Sheriff Patty that we weren't under HOA jurisdiction, but she'd insisted. My wife wanted me to call Sheriff Patty directly and straighten this out, but I had a feeling that would just make things worse. Instead, I decided to ignore it completely. If we weren't part of the HOA, then their violation notices were basically just strongly worded junk mail. That decision apparently drove Sheriff Patty absolutely crazy. Over the next year, I'd periodically find more violation notices. Our trash cans were out 6 hours early. Our lawn was half an inch too tall. We had a decorative garden gnome that wasn't on the approved lawn ornament list. Each notice got increasingly aggressive in tone, threatening escalating fines and legal action. I saved every single one in a folder, mostly for entertainment value. My wife and I would read them out loud over dinner and laugh about what Sheriff Patty would find objectionable next. It became this running joke between us. The thing that really seemed to bother Sheriff Patty was that I never responded to any of her notices. Every other homeowner in the subdivision would immediately comply with her demands, no matter how ridiculous. She was used to total obedience. But here was this house right in the middle of her domain, and she had absolutely no power over it. You could tell it was eating away at her. I'd see her driving by our house slowly, sometimes multiple times a day. She'd take photos of our property from her car window, probably looking for new violations to invent. A few neighbors mentioned that she'd been asking questions about us at HOA meetings, trying to figure out how to bring us under their authority. This went on for about 2 years. Sheriff Patty would send violation notices, I'd ignore them, and she'd get more frustrated. It was like this weird, passive-aggressive standoff. My wife kept saying we should just talk to her and explain the situation properly, but I figured our legal status was our legal status. We didn't owe her an explanation. Then, last spring, things escalated. Our front porch had been looking pretty rough for a while. The previous owners had painted it this weird mustard yellow color sometime in the 1990s, and between weather and age, it was peeling and fading badly. It was definitely time for a refresh. Now, I could have played it safe and chosen some boring beige color that would blend in with the rest of the neighborhood, but honestly, after 2 years of Sheriff Patty's harassment, I was feeling a bit spiteful. Plus, it's our house, and we should be able to paint it whatever color we want. I spent a lot of time at the paint store looking at different options. I wanted something that was tasteful and would look good with our house's style, but was definitely not on the HOA's approved color palette. After going through probably 50 different samples, I settled on this gorgeous color called Harbor Fog Blue. It was this beautiful, soft blue-gray that would complement our house's brick foundation perfectly. The HOA-approved colors were all variations of beige, cream, and gray. Very bland, very safe. Harbor Fog Blue was definitely blue enough to stand out, but it wasn't obnoxious or garish. It was the kind of color you'd see on a house in a coastal town or a historic district. Classy, but definitely not HOA approved. I bought the paint on a Friday and planned to start the project that weekend. Saturday morning, I was out on the porch setting up my equipment when I noticed Sheriff Patty's car driving by unusually slowly. She actually came to almost a complete stop in front of our house, and I could see her taking photos through her windshield. I waved at her cheerfully, which clearly wasn't the reaction she was expecting. She quickly drove off, but I had a feeling this was just the beginning. I spent Saturday pressure washing the porch and scraping off the loose paint. It was satisfying work, and I was listening to this true crime podcast that made the time go by quickly. Sheriff Patty drove by 3 more times that day, each time slowing down to stare at what I was doing. Sunday morning, I started taping everything off and laying down drop cloths. The weather was perfect for painting, not too hot and no wind. I was just opening the first can of Harbor Fog Blue when I saw Sheriff Patty marching up our front walkway with a clipboard in her hand. Now, I'd never actually spoken to Sheriff Patty face-to-face before. All our communication had been through those violation notices, but I could tell from her body language that she was fired up about something. She was walking with this determined stride like she was heading into battle. She didn't even say hello or introduce herself. Her first words were something like, "You need to stop what you're doing immediately." She was holding up some kind of form and telling me that I hadn't filed a Form 7B for exterior modifications and that all painting had to be approved by the Architectural Review Committee first. I was holding a paintbrush at this point, and I just looked at her calmly and said something like, "I've got approval from the Department of It's My House." That clearly wasn't the response she was expecting. She got this look on her face like I'd just personally insulted her. She started going on about community standards and property values, getting more worked up with each sentence. This is when I decided to try explaining the situation one more time. I told her as politely as I could that we weren't part of the HOA and weren't subject to their rules. I mentioned the grandfather clause in our deed and suggested she check with the HOA's legal counsel if she had questions about our status. Well, that just made her angrier. She started raising her voice, saying things like everyone in the neighborhood was part of the HOA and that I was being selfish and destructive to community values. She seemed to take our independence as a personal attack on her authority. At this point, I was getting annoyed. I'd been polite, I'd explained the situation, and she was standing on my porch yelling at me about rules that didn't apply to me. So I did what any reasonable person would do. I ignored her and started painting. The moment that Harbor Fog Blue touched the porch railing, Sheriff Patty absolutely lost it. She started screaming about vandalism and property destruction. She actually stepped onto the porch, right into my paint area, and got blue paint on her expensive-looking white shoes. This made her even more furious because now I'd apparently ruined her shoes in addition to destroying the neighborhood. She was yelling about how I was lowering everyone's property values and defacing community property. I kept painting calmly while she ranted. I had my earbuds in with my podcast, so I could tune out most of her screaming. Every few minutes I'd hear her say something particularly ridiculous, and I'd just shake my head and keep working. Then I heard her on the phone. At first, I thought she was calling her husband or maybe the HOA management company, but then I started catching bits of the conversation and I realized she was talking to 911. Now, this is where things get really crazy. She wasn't just reporting a neighbor dispute or asking for someone to come mediate. She was telling the operator that there was a belligerent man destroying property with a weapon. The weapon apparently was the extension pole I was using for my paint roller. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. She was describing me as some kind of dangerous vandal attacking community property with a weapon. She was using this panicked, breathless voice like she was reporting a violent crime in progress. I pulled out my earbuds and just stared at her while she finished the call. When she hung up, she had this satisfied smile on her face, like she'd just solved all her problems. She told me that the police were on their way and I was going to jail for vandalism and trespassing. I just shrugged and went back to painting. What else was I going to do? I was on my own property, painting my own house, with my own paint. If Sheriff Patty wanted to waste police resources on her tantrum, that was her choice. About 10 minutes later, I heard sirens. Not just one car, but multiple vehicles. Apparently, when someone calls 911 reporting a man with a weapon, they take it seriously. 2 squad cars pulled up in front of our house, and 4 officers got out. Now, this is where the scene gets pretty funny if you think about it from the officer's perspective. They're expecting to find some kind of violent confrontation. Instead, they find a middle-aged guy in old clothes calmly painting his porch while listening to a podcast, and a well-dressed woman standing on the sidewalk screaming about property values. The officers approached cautiously at first, probably trying to figure out where the weapon was. When they realized the weapon was just a paint roller on an extension pole, I could see their whole demeanor change. They went from high alert to barely contained annoyance in about 30 seconds. One of the officers asked me to put down the roller, which I did. I wiped my hands on a rag and explained that I was just painting my porch and wasn't sure why the police had been called. The officer looked at the paint setup, looked at Sheriff Patty, and I could see him putting the pieces together. Meanwhile, Sheriff Patty was trying to take charge of the situation. She was telling the officers to arrest me for vandalizing community property. She was pointing at the wet paint like it was evidence of some heinous crime. That's when I remembered the binder. I told the officers to wait just a minute, went inside, and came back with that thick folder our realtor had given us. I pulled out the deed and handed it to one of the officers, pointing to the highlighted section about the HOA exemption. I finished the first coat of paint late that afternoon, and even with just one coat, the Harbor Fog Blue looked amazing. It totally transformed the look of our house in the best way possible. The color was sophisticated and calming, and it made our old farmhouse look like something out of a design magazine. Over the next few days, I added a second coat and touched up all the trim. The end result was even better than I'd hoped. The blue-gray color perfectly complemented our brick foundation and made the white trim pop. It was exactly the kind of classic, timeless look I'd been going for. More importantly, it was clearly visible from Sheriff Patty's kitchen window. I may have deliberately chosen the shade partly out of spite, but I wasn't going to deny that seeing her curtains twitch whenever I was out on the porch gave me a certain satisfaction, but I wasn't done yet. See, our porch had always been pretty bare, just the wooden floor and railings, no furniture or decoration. But now that it was this gorgeous Harbor Fog Blue, it seemed like a shame not to make better use of the space. So the following weekend I went shopping for porch furniture, and completely by coincidence I happened to find these beautiful Adirondack chairs that were painted in almost the exact same Harbor Fog Blue as the porch. They were perfect for the space, and the blue color would really tie everything together. I bought 4 of them, along with a small matching side table. When I arranged them on the porch, the effect was stunning. The monochromatic blue color scheme made everything look intentional and designed, like something you'd see in a home decorating magazine. Now, I'll admit, when I positioned the chairs, I may have been slightly influenced by the fact that they'd be perfectly visible from Sheriff Patty's kitchen window. If someone were sitting in those chairs, they'd be looking directly across the street toward her house. Not that I was planning to sit there and stare at her house, but the symbolism was definitely there. The chairs were delivered on a Thursday, and I spent that evening setting everything up. Friday morning, I was having my coffee on the new porch setup when I saw Sheriff Patty's kitchen curtain twitch. I raised my coffee mug in a little salute, even though I'm not sure she could see me clearly enough to catch the gesture. Over the next few weeks, something interesting started happening in the neighborhood. Maybe it was seeing Sheriff Patty get her comeuppance, or maybe people had just been waiting for someone to break the ice, but suddenly other homeowners started pushing back against the more ridiculous HOA rules. The older gentleman planted his rose garden, and when he got a violation notice, he actually fought it and won. The young couple painted their front door a gorgeous deep red, and several other homeowners followed suit with their own door color rebellions. Someone installed a decorative mailbox that was definitely not on the approved list. Sheriff Patty tried to crack down harder at first, sending out even more violation notices and threatening legal action. But without the automatic compliance she was used to, her authority started crumbling. People were questioning her interpretation of the rules, demanding to see specific language in the HOA documents, and generally refusing to be intimidated. About 2 months after the porch painting incident, I heard through the neighborhood grapevine that Sheriff Patty had resigned as HOA president. Apparently, there had been a pretty heated board meeting where multiple homeowners showed up to complain about her enforcement tactics. The final straw was when someone brought up the police citation she'd received for filing a false report. The new HOA president was apparently much more reasonable, focusing on actual community issues like maintaining common areas and organizing neighborhood events rather than measuring grass with rulers. As for Sheriff Patty herself, she seemed to pretty much disappear from neighborhood life after that. I'd see her occasionally coming and going from her house, but she kept to herself and definitely stayed away from our property. The daily drive-bys and violation notices stopped completely. My wife and I have been enjoying our blue porch immensely. It's become our favorite spot for morning coffee and evening relaxation. The color has held up beautifully through a full season of weather, and we still get compliments from neighbors who walk by. Sometimes when I'm sitting out there in one of those Adirondack chairs, I think about how this whole situation could have been avoided if Sheriff Patty had just accepted that she didn't have authority over everyone in the neighborhood. Her need to control every detail of other people's property was what ultimately led to her downfall. The officer read through it carefully, looked at our house number, looked at the address on the deed, and then looked at Sheriff Patty. You could see the moment when he realized what was actually happening here. This is where we get to the title of my story. The officer looked directly at Sheriff Patty and said in this completely deadpan voice, "Ma'am, you said he was vandalizing community property, but his name is on the deed. Why are you on his porch?" Sheriff Patty's face went through about 6 different expressions in the span of 2 seconds. First confusion, then anger, then this dawning realization that she might have made a mistake. She started stammering about how it was spiritually community property because everyone in the neighborhood had to look at it. The officer was not amused. He asked her if she lived at this address, and when she said no, he asked what gave her the right to be on our property, telling us what we could do with our own house. She tried to explain about the HOA and community standards, but he cut her off. Now here's where Sheriff Patty's 911 call really came back to bite her. The officer pointed out that she had reported a man with a weapon destroying property. He said the paint roller hardly qualified as a weapon. And since it was clearly our property based on the deed, there was no vandalism occurring. But more importantly, he said, filing a false police report was a crime, especially when it resulted in emergency resources being diverted from actual emergencies. He asked her why she felt it was appropriate to lie to 911 dispatchers about a weapon when she knew perfectly well I was just painting. Sheriff Patty tried to backtrack, claiming she'd been frightened and wasn't sure what I might do with the paint roller, but the officer wasn't buying it. He said anyone could see this was a neighbor dispute, not an emergency, and she deliberately exaggerated the situation to get a faster police response. While this conversation was happening, more neighbors had started gathering on the sidewalk. Apparently, multiple police cars in the neighborhood had attracted attention. I recognized a few faces from around the subdivision, and they were all watching Sheriff Patty get dressed down by the police officer with obvious interest. After checking with his partner and probably calling in to verify some information, the officer came back with his citation book. He wrote Sheriff Patty a ticket for misuse of emergency services. He also officially trespassed her from our property, meaning she couldn't set foot on our land again without risking arrest. The look on Sheriff Patty's face when she got that citation was priceless. This was a woman who was used to being the one handing out violations and consequences. Now she was on the receiving end, and she clearly didn't know how to handle it. The officers spent a few more minutes with me, mostly apologizing for the waste of time and making sure I didn't want to press any additional charges. I told them I just wanted to finish painting my porch in peace. They said that was perfectly reasonable and told me to call if Sheriff Patty bothered me again. As the police cars drove away, I looked around at the neighbors who had gathered to watch. Most of them were trying not to smile, but you could tell they were enjoying the show. Sheriff Patty had apparently made herself pretty unpopular in the neighborhood with her aggressive enforcement tactics. Sheriff Patty herself was still standing on the sidewalk, looking stunned. She kept staring at the citation in her hand like she couldn't believe it was real. A few neighbors tried to approach her, probably to ask what had happened, but she brushed them off and marched back toward her house. I went back to painting, and over the next hour, several neighbors stopped by to chat. Turns out a lot of people in the subdivision were pretty fed up with Sheriff Patty's reign of terror. They'd all been too intimidated to push back against her ridiculous rules, but seeing her get shut down by the police seemed to give them some hope. One older gentleman told me he'd been wanting to plant roses in his front yard for years, but they weren't on the approved plant list. A young couple mentioned they'd been dreaming of painting their front door red, but were afraid of the fines. It was like Sheriff Patty's public humiliation had given everyone permission to think about rebelling. The best part is that our house now stands out in the neighborhood in exactly the way we wanted when we bought it. We're not part of the cookie-cutter HOA aesthetic, and we're proud of that independence. The Harbor Fog Blue Porch is like a daily reminder that sometimes standing up for your rights, even in small ways, can have bigger consequences than you expect. And every morning when I sit on that porch with my coffee, looking out at a neighborhood where people are finally free to express some personality in their home choices, I'm reminded that the binder was worth every penny we paid for this house. The moral of the story, I suppose, is to always know your rights, keep good documentation, and never underestimate the power of a well-chosen paint color to make a statement. And if you're going to be a petty tyrant, make sure you actually have the authority to back up your threats, because eventually, someone's going to call your bluff. Looking back, I almost feel sorry for Sheriff Patty. Almost. She created a situation where she had no power but convinced herself she was in charge, and when reality finally caught up with her, the fall was pretty spectacular. But that's what happens when you try to control things that aren't yours to control. These days, our porch is exactly what we wanted it to be. Our neighborhood is a much more pleasant place to live, and I've got a story that my friends never get tired of hearing. Not bad for a weekend painting project that got completely out of hand. And if any current or future HOA presidents are reading this, here's some free advice. Pick your battles wisely, know the limits of your actual authority, and maybe invest in a hobby that doesn't involve measuring other people's grass. You'll save everyone a lot of trouble, including yourself. The Harbor Fog Blue Porch stands as a monument to property rights, and every time I look at it, I smile a little. Sometimes the best revenge really is just living well, especially when you get to do it in exactly the color you want. The next one is a malicious compliance story. Backstory. For the past few years, I've been a nurse. I spent the first part of my career in the emergency at a small hospital in Canada. We can do basic admissions, surgeries, and critical care, but we'll transfer the really sick ones to larger metropolitan hospitals with more services like cardiology or trauma surgery. Because the population we served was so small, we ran with the bare minimum of nurses to keep the department afloat, usually resulting in an extra patient per nurse compared to other hospitals, but with a lower acuity level, on average, so it balances out. As a result, we would often be overwhelmed during the second half of the day shift and the start of the night shift when it was most busy, but due to low volumes of patients later on in the night, we often were well enough staffed to easily handle the workload. That is, we could safely run even fewer nurses, but management hadn't gone there. Secondly, because we ran with such a small number of nurses, we never had break cover, so if your nursing partner was on break, you would watch double the number of patients. Not a big deal at night, but during day, this could result in missing our last 30-minute unpaid break on the day shift due to high workload. A last piece of info is that we use teams of one emergency nurse, a nurse extra training to have a higher scope of care, and one med-surg nurse, seasoned nurse awaiting a spot in the additional training program. Because of this, the nurses would give and take report together, so instead of each nurse handing over 5 patients simultaneously, they hand over 8, 10 together, so report takes twice as long. Our union had negotiated our contract to counteract any wage theft, allowing us to sign for our unpaid 30-minute break at overtime rates of 1.5x pay. We missed this break maybe every other day shift, so once during a 2-day, 2-night rotation, as well as sign for an additional 15 minutes of straight time pay in case handover went over our 12-hour shift, which was always. Of course, management didn't like having to pay this out, but it wasn't an issue because we, the nurses, were also stealing time. I know it doesn't sound great, but on those quiet night shifts, we would often take an extra 45 minutes to sleep, which balanced out those 1.5-2 hours of lost pay from the day shifts and handover. Because the workload was so low at the time, and because only one emergency physician was on at night, it could be easily managed by one nurse, so patient throughput was the same as if 2 nurses were working. We often sit around waiting for orders from the doctor. Furthermore, nurses always left their number with their partner so we could be called back early if it kicked off and needed all hands on deck. Obviously, if we had many very sick patients, we stuck to the entitled amount only, or missed it entirely. Everyone was happy for the first few years I worked there. The management, and therefore government, saved the extra pay without affecting patient throughput, and the extra sleep time on break really helped to maintain nurse well-being, as well as making the switch from nights back to days much easier. Then one of our less pleasant charge nurses got angry at this. The charge nurse role is like the boss of the unit. On most units with admitted patients, this was an 0800 1600 Monday to Friday type gig that was covered by regular bedside nurses when the charge nurse wasn't there. In emergency, however, we had specific nurses working rotating shifts in this role with a small pay bump and any gaps in the schedule filled by very senior emergency nurses, as it was a much more unique beast to manage. I say this only to give benefit of the doubt that this nurse was probably stressed out like crazy every shift. So I'm sitting at work in the morning, waiting for the inevitable onslaught when the email pops up stating night shifts are to be limited to union-mandated break time only. I'm a bit pissed off at it, but ultimately they're right. We're only entitled to 60 minutes of unpaid break time and 45 minutes of paid break time. And to be fair, some nurses were definitely abusing the previous system. One nurse who covered charge would advocate for over 3.5 hours of break time on a night shift, regardless of how sick the patients were, and that would affect patient safety as it bled into the first part of the night when we actually still busy. Most of the nurses refused to follow them on this. However, people like this were rare. Most nurses don't come to the emergency to be lazy. This email soon gets posted in our group chats so everyone's aware. A lot of the younger staff, millennials at this time, were aware of our rights and immediately started signing for all missed breaks, as well as additional handover time, as well as helping the older staff understand the contract. I missed my last break that shift and stayed until quarter past shift change for report, so I got an extra $50 gross on my paycheck for that. The charge nurse on that day was surprised when I presented to OT form for their signature, but I just told them I was following the rules to prevent any pay discrepancies. My next shift, at night, there was a sign-in sheet on the desk for us to write our in and out time for breaks, with a space for our phone number too, so they could call us back. Even though we weren't paid the extra $4 an hour to be on call, and calling us back should have been paid at overtime rates per the contract. I refused to leave my number, stating that unless there was a code blue, medical emergency usually means there's no pulse. There was no way I was coming back early. Code blues were called overhead, so they didn't need my number. For the next 2 weeks, I stuck to the contract. Every missed break and extended handover was documented, and of course, I signed in and out of my breaks on the dot. I spent so much time on night shifts staring at my phone waiting for the doctor to give me something to do as I'd caught up on everything else. It might not seem like a lot, but that extra hour of handover pay plus occasional missed breaks per shift set would have added up to roughly $2,000 extra per year per full-time nurse, which is a decent amount of change to a publicly funded healthcare system. Eventually, the manager noticed and came around clarifying that while they would sign for any extra wages if we wished, we could also choose to sleep extra on nights if we wished, providing we left our number. I asked for them to email that to me, and while I could have sent that straight to the union rep, I didn't bother, as I had already gotten the sleep time back. I left that job later on and have been very happy at a much bigger hospital for 2 years now. Now I have a nurse come cover mine and my partner's break. There's no teams, and they encourage us to take longer breaks when possible to prevent staff burnout, which was really prevalent at this one. I now document my missed breaks and extra sleep time to make sure it matches up. They're also willing to sign for missed breaks on top of that to help staff retention, but my conscience doesn't let me go that far. I'm just happy to sleep. Anyway, thank you for watching.